Hello? Good evening and welcome. Welcome indeed. My name is Hannes Stiefel. I'm from the Institute of Art and Architecture, and from the IKA. We are very, very pleased that we can be somehow the host of this evening, an evening which will be featuring kind of two people or two work, let's say. One is the work of Timo Penttilä, which I'm kind of not capable or not capable to talk about, but Alfred Berger will talk about him more. At the one hand, I don't know him so well or his work so well, since at the time when he was teaching here, I was studying at another Viennese school, and there was not really a close relation between the schools. At the same time, we for sure knew his building he has done in his housing project he has done in Gumpendorfer Straße. But at the IKA, I think whenever I hear something about Penttilä, it's somehow kind of a secret, or I hear about these things that he had lived in remote places, whether it was in far north or in Finland or in Tuscany, and it's never really, or it's always about the respect of this person, but I never really heard somebody talking about his work. So there is always something, a mystery around it. The other person, but Alfred Berger will talk about this much more and much more competent. At the other hand, there is Roger Connah here. Roger Connah, I'm very happy that he's here. He's a kind of an old friend of mine. And the first time that we meet in Vienna, Roger Connah is from Wales, and I don't know how I should describe him. He's an author, a writer, an independent schooler, and I would say a cultural activist, also a filmmaker, and he's currently teaching also at in Carleton University in Ottawa, in Canada, and he has written a lot of books. One, maybe the most famous, but the most known book is Writing Architecture, which was a book about a person which a lot of people kind of cannot distinct from Timo Penttilä from the name. It's Reima Piettilä, which is really a seminal book about a monography about his work, but also about a compendium about modernism and postmodernism, and a very, let's say, idiosyncratic work, I would say. Then just two books mainly I mentioned, Welcome to the Hotel Architecture, where Roger says, you can always check out, but you can never leave it. This hotel actually really exists, or somehow I think it exists, or it existed once. When I met him, I called him about 2 years later and asked, I would like to check in the Hotel Architecture, and he said, oh, come, you're very welcome, but it's still under construction. So I don't know if it's finished or if it's closed again or what happens with that, but the book is really worth to read. And then How Architecture Got Its Hump was another book. And then for us, very important at the moment, since in the IKA we have the topic of learning architectures, where students think about how we go on with the education or teaching and learning architecture. Roger has written this anti-library, and one book of that is called Deschooling Architecture, which is a big topic in our institute at the moment, or at least for some people. The students had the pleasure to have Roger in the review this afternoon, and we talked about the secret, and then a quote came into my mind from Adolf Muschk, who once has said, and I quote him in German, because maybe I can recall it in German, I have translated it to Roger before shortly. Adolf Muschk was, because it's an evening about two people, about an author and about the subject or another person he writes about, and Adolf Muschk has written this, has said this sentence, wie bringt man als Autor eine Figur dazu, dass sie ihr Geheimnis bewahrt und zugleich ein Geheimnis des Autors hütet, auch gegen ihn selbst? And since it's not only about this book, I think tonight it's about really the relation of author, of the performance of an author, and the porträtierte person or his work, I really am looking forward to see which secrets Roger is either uncover or preserving, and which secrets of himself and which secrets of Timo Penttilä. Thank you.
So, guten Abend, hello to you all, dear ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you tonight as chairman of the Timo Penttilä Society. Thank you, Hannes, for this great introduction. And I want to talk briefly about the activities of the Timo Penttilä Society. Timo was working in the academy from 1980 to 1998. And when Timo Penttilä passed away in 2011, a commemoration was organized spontaneously here in the house with the support of the Institute. And many alumni came to this event and held short lectures about some topics they were related with Penttilä or with the teaching in the school. And in the debates after this event, we sort of felt that there was a lot of fuss about some not so great architects, and we thought that it's a little bit a sad fact that about Timo Penttilä there were no publications and no exhibitions, and that maybe we could contribute to bring some light into this black hole that sort of surrounds Timo Penttilä since the 90s. The founding of the Timo Penttilä emerged from this event, and as a small independent institution, we are not able to do big things on our own, like publications or exhibitions, but we are watchful on what happens and try to connect activities and people interested in Timo's work. And we work towards collecting and distributing material, so making possible for people to research. And therefore, there is a homepage that is developed on the website. And Timo was president of the Finnish Architecture Museum between 1976 and 1980. And we believe that an exhibition in the Finnish Architecture Museum would be an appropriate sort of thing to achieve from our view. We try to help that this happens in the coming years. That's our sort of Fernziel, our aim. So there's another big story about Penttilä. Despite being a great architect, he found himself in the middle of a titanic hassle in the midst of Finnish architecture elites, and this detail is something that Roger is going to talk about or bring light on. I agreed with Roger just to say some words about Timo in Vienna, since this is missing in the official accounts. Penttilä came to Vienna succeeding a call from Professor Rainer. Rainer was head of the Meisterschule, one Rainer, one Peichel. His arrival coincided with two exhibitions of his work. The first in Stuttgart, called Finnish Architecture in 1979, and the second 1980 at the Royal Institute of British Architecture in London. So these two exhibitions are both accompanied by very nice, in the taste of the time, not so big, but very well done catalogs, which remain so far main sources for everybody interested in Penttilä. By his arrival in Vienna, he was 49, and his CV showed already an impressive list of buildings and academic positions. At the age of 29, he had won the competition for the new Helsinki City Theatre, which would become one of his most important works. This was followed by a long list of highly regarded buildings and designs. At the same time, he was teaching from 59 on at the Helsinki TU and was visiting professor in Berkeley 68 to 69. He was president of the Finnish Architecture Museum, as mentioned, from 76 to 80. So when he came here, sort of was on the apogee of a Finnish career. Arriving in Vienna, Penttilä impressed us. Why did we go to this school? I must say that it was certainly a lot of hazard for many, since he was not really known among the candidates for the Aufnahmeprüfung. But what impressed us when we met him was really this figure that was completely different from other professors in this sleepy Vienna, which we had in 1980. He sort of was the image of an internationally successful Bjarke Ingels today, the one who wins competitions and goes out in the world and does architecture on a very high standard. In Vienna, Penttilä was leading the school through the difficult 80s with postmodernism dominating the scene and sort of continuing Roland Reiner's way, avoiding to taking sides with the zeitgeist too much. In his work with students, he tried to explore the roots of architecture as being something organic, structural, self-evident, away from theory and always powerful. To have worked with him as a student was a unique experience. He appreciated the freedom of thought in all concepts, but always asked for clarity and consistency in elaboration. His intellectual standards were high. He was not a friend of fiddling and speculation. Reviews with the professor were quite unique for most of us, since Penttilä was a master in the Nordic art of controlled or even taciturn conversations. In a period where rigorous formalism dominated architecture, Penttilä taught his students the masterful handling of structures and forms. He impressed us with his virtuosity in dealing with huge volumes, his refinement in using topography and the capacity of interpreting huge, complicated programs in respect of the site. This fascinated us. It appeared that these elements are why Timo Penttilä's architecture is more in fashion today than it was maybe in the 80s and 90s. Vienna in the 80s was a place where the greatest talents up to the age of 50 were allowed maybe to do a cafe, maybe a roof extension. Penttilä fascinated us because he was bypassed all the limitations of the establishment. He was the big enigma, the star who gave us hope that maybe also in Vienna international standards could be visible someday. The impressions made by Timo certainly faded in the later years when health problems and the difficult situation in Finland troubled his life and also his personal career. Now, at this point, I wish to express my thanks to Roger Connah, first to Director Eva Blimlinger for supporting this event from the beginning on. I thank the staff of the Academy and of the Institute of Architecture and the Alumni Association for their great assistance. Thanks to my partners in the Timo Penttilä Society who worked hard for this, Kilian Matic, Peter Talbauer and Jutta. And further, the event has been sponsored by a number of architectural practices that graduated from the Meisterschule. Thank you to Geri Eicher, Dorna Matt, Kub Karl, Van Bremhorst, Burtscher, Durig, ZT, and Sandbichler Architekten and Berger Parkinen Architekten. I am particularly grateful to my team, thanks to Eva Jussel, especially. Without her, nothing happened here, who was responsible for organizing this event together with Lucy Naviarova for the graphic design. Over there you see a book table. Later, Roger will be standing there, pencil in hand, so you are welcome to buy books, especially if you connect them to buy with a gift to the society. I first heard about Roger Connah from Timo Penttilä when we were sitting at a campfire in Lapland, or maybe it was in Tuscany, I don't remember. But I remember well, it was very thrilling to Penttilä, these talks he had with Roger, and unfortunately at this time the project did not come to fulfillment. And we are very glad that finally Roger found the impulse to dig out these old tapes and papers to finally publish this wonderful book. Roger Connah is one of the few experts in Nordic architecture coming from abroad, and this gives him very high importance to my estimation, because his observations and analysis are particularly high value in a field dominated by insiders writing about insiders. He's the only sort of outsider bringing in his opinion. So I don't want to go on anymore here. I'm very, very pleased to let this podium to Roger Connah.
Do you think we could have this light out, please? Thank you, Alfred, and the Timo Penttilä Society. And again, thanks to the rector, Eva Blimlinga, Wolfgang, and Hannes for the opportunity to speak in this space. To speak this evening about a man, an architect, a country, and, well, frankly, a whole host of myths and exaggerations that often go up to making what is called Finnish architecture. And perhaps I will speak something about a book. It might be too that this space indicated in this image resonates within our mind. 2006, I think, in this space, a module to be linked with different kinds of discourses. I prefer to call what I will say not a discourse, but an entertainment. I will proceed with 10 small fragments, with, if time, some readings in between. I hope to speak for about 45-50 minutes to give time for some conversation afterwards. And I would like, later, some thoughts to be shared by many of you who probably know this person in a way much better than I did. This really goes without saying. But this is the crux of what Penttilä was about, and what slowly started to transpire over the years. Good building is not a secret science decided upon in the closed circle of elite architects. It is not also the obvious truth that the Finnish Architectural Review proclaims, like the muezzin from his minaret. Building serves complex plans for life, which reach far beyond itself, and which can be assessed from within building, only to a limited extent. This was written in 1985. I have 3 confessions to make at first. I stopped writing out and preparing lectures some years ago. I wish I could say I have an option, but I don't really. It was all part of this strange journey within architecture and writing that I have traveled. I have never felt that I was the real professor that should be addressing you here in this room. In many ways, I've always felt it more interesting to be a barely credible being. That is a recent description of me in the Finnish Architectural Review in relation to this book on Penttilä, The School of Exile. Secondly, I have grown tired of speaking and writing about architecture and what I think we can call, or at least Timo shared with me, the cathedral of critical misery. But there are many of you here who have more knowledge of this architecture and educator. Yes, I met him. No, it wasn't a conversation. Yes, I talked with him briefly. No, I never drank with him. Yes, we had saunas together. No, I didn't know he nearly died of alcohol. Yes, I visited him in 1994 here in this building, in that special room. Yes, he took me into that room. I have never felt more the imposter in my life when he took me into Otto Wagner's room. I had with me a book in my hand, The End of Finnish Architecture. He looked at it as Timo did. He picked it up. "You are brave," he said. "No Finns will understand even the title." I knew then that I would visit him in Tuscany. He was right. Third confession. The book started by chance. I had lost contact with Timo after the visit to his vineyard and some letters. I had hoped he would continue his impossible book. I felt somewhat guilty. I had gone on to become a professor just as he had retreated from being a professor. We lost contact. I didn't try to contact. He didn't. That was it. Then I heard of his death. A couple of people in Finland informed me, "Have you anything on him we might publish?" A couple asked. I remembered a film script. I remembered my meeting in Sinalunga in Tuscany. I had wanted to make a film and had written a film treatment. Then it all disappeared. I had notebooks, a journal kept, whilst we talked non-stop for 4 days. "Wouldn't this work for you?" I said to the editor. "It's not a coherent picture. It's not even a critical inquiry. We could get others to write. It could be a hybrid book, the book before the book, a labyrinth in a way. No meaning where none intended, as Samuel Beckett said. No coherence where none intended." So that's the book. Just a few documents. A small compendium, not even complete with missing parts. The missing parts? Penttilä's Austrian self, as you have heard from Alfred. Or his Italian self. Or his Lap self. So it's an anti-memoir, a book that refuses to become a book. Can we speak of Timo Penttilä in this way? So I prefer now to write poems and read them in place of any lecture I give. I will, however, break my promise to myself for shorter periods tonight and offer you something that is not poetry. But first, a poem by John Ashbery. It is about Finland, written around the time I met Ashbery in Lahti Literature Seminar in 1979. Somewhere, someone is traveling furiously toward you. At incredible speed, traveling day and night, through blizzards and desert heat, across torrents, through narrow passes. But will he know where to find you? Recognize you when he sees you? Give you the thing he has for you? Hardly anything grows here. Yet the granaries are bursting with meal. The sacks of meal piled to the rafters. The streams run with sweetness, fattening fish. Birds darken the sky. Is it enough that the dish of milk is set out at night? That we think of him sometimes and always, with mixed feelings. I cite this from Lari Alapolonen website entry. Penttilä died unexpectedly in 2011 after having caught a fever while staying at his cottage in Lapland. After the death, there has been somewhat a revival about his work. His former students in Vienna formed the Timo Penttilä Society, and his fiercely critical book on architectural theory, Oikeat ja väärat arkkitehdit, right or wrong architects, was published posthumously in Finland. One wonders if the recognition came a bit too late. For instance, one of Penttilä's key works, the one you see in the picture, the office building for Suomen Sokkari in Tapiola, was lately demolished without much of a public conversation. I was driving past the demolition, the writer says, with a rather prominent Finnish architect who, when I mentioned about the fact, wasn't aware that the building was designed by Penttilä. There are many others. So it was about 21 years ago when I visited this so-called fiercely critical architect. As I said, I had in my hand the small book I had written, The End of Finnish Architecture. I had met Timo in Finland, mainly in the 1970s, when I worked in close collaboration with the architect Reima Pietala. He was taciturn, reserved, even closed. He was never anything but polite, dignified. But there was, how can I put it, a wonderful Finnish gruffness about him. Wonderful to me, that is. I liked him. He seemed to share the solitude and melancholy that I had gone to Finland to find. If we can say someone's character suits us, then Timo's character suited mine. If Timo Penttilä had been a dog, he would have perhaps been an Akita. This is that rather large and powerful breed with a somewhat noble and intimidating presence. Originally used in feudal Japan for guarding royalty and nobility, this is a dog that tracks and hunts wild boar, black bear, and sometimes deer. Timo in many ways was that fearless and loyal guardian of his family. His family in this case was not only his own farming community near Tampere, but he was guardian in a sense of a respect to the earth, to earth's strength, we might call it, to the local and also the communal. He thought with archaeological resonance. He had a small family, only now his sister remains. It is this resonance to the earth that came up whenever he spoke of his father and the land. But like the dog, the Akita, Timo did not back down from challenges. He was, I understood, initially very shy, as befits a country farming Finn. He did not frighten easily. Significantly, his affection was embedded, undemonstrative. As I said, he was immensely respectful. His gruffness was a dignity. And by the way, the Finnish great Japanese dog club, Suomen suuria panin koira ry, for those of you who understand the Finnish, was established in the autumn of 2003. This is the photograph of the helmsman. There are not many photographs of Timo Penttilä. Perhaps they have been destroyed. Perhaps he didn't encourage the photograph. Perhaps there are other reasons. The photograph was offered by his partner in Helsinki, the architect Kari Lind, who worked with him for many years. It seemed natural to choose this for the cover of the book. The pose looks deceptively controlled, but why? There is more than a hint of calm concentration. The right hand is almost nonchalantly, lightly holding the rudder stick. The yacht might not even be moving as far as we know. The sun is overhead, and I want to suggest there is utter control of the boat. But that's fiction. There, Timo Penttilä is dressed ready for the wind in one of those lightly puffed polyester windjammers that yachtsmen used. But it is the hat, surely, which is simply impossible not to notice. It is tight, possibly a size too small. I could exaggerate further and say I read a deep concern in the pose, something sterner than the image. But what in this life of an architect is sterner than the image? Does it tell us something of those easy souls he was struggling against in Finnish architecture? Deception would ensure realities remained hidden for Penttilä. Timo may already have known at this stage what he would have done later to survive. He steered out of an alcoholic fog. He was clear about this when I met him in 1997. He nearly died, but I don't know the circumstances. He had one or two near affairs, but I don't know the circumstances. Then he lost interest. He said, "In architecture," I said. "In all," he said. He steered away from the modernism he saw so compromised by his colleagues. But there was a censorship and clannishness within Finland. Some architecture was considered right, some considered wrong. The lines were blurred, always blurred, but the games played very serious. A study of the politics of architectural friendship would amplify this. That is, if we could find anyone to speak directly about these times. Few seem to want to speak directly about such important things. There was a narrowness in Finnish architecture around the 60s and 1970s that made sure the closer Penttilä was to reality, the more extreme and aloof he was considered. The yachtsman can also be alone. It seemed any photograph of the posed architect or the man seated at a conference table or lecturing would not do here. The helmsman with the touch, that lightest of control on the rudder, might be as good as it gets. But something was missing. This is an image of two architects in Finland. The person we're talking about has just left the image. On the left is Timo Penttilä. On the right is School Exile. It's remarkable, these P's that keep on coming out in Finnish architecture. Penttilä, Penttilä, Exile. And Timo left with me at that moment and walked away in his own reserved manner. I went one way, he went the other. And I thought, perhaps I wouldn't see him again. But then, Finnish architecture was sailing along until its rational tendencies, and these were hard, had to entertain postmodernism. There was panic. The Finns pulled together. This photograph, I remember, of Timo Penttilä was on board the schooner where the USA-Finland seminar on the future of architecture took place in 1980. It was organized by the Museum of Finnish Architecture, directed at the time by Timo Penttilä. It was an attempt to meet the postmodern invasion of Charles Moore, Hans Hollein, and Charles Jenks, and a few others, head-on. This band of architects were invited to Finland and sailed out to the islands outside Helsinki on a schooner, no doubt with a fair amount of liquid refreshment and sun. They debated what many were considering a direct threat to modernism, and in this case, a direct threat to Finnish rationalism, led in the main by two architects at the time, Juhani Palasmaa and Kirmo Mikkola. I won't go into detail about these, just to give you some reference. Penttilä sat somewhere off to the distance. You've surely spotted him, maybe there. Look for the person in the Nordic sweater. Right up in the top right-hand corner with his dark glasses on. He is perched higher, looking down through dark glasses at people like Michael Graves, Charles Jenks, Hans Hollein, Dennis Sharp, Juhani Palasmaa, Christian Guriksen, Sakari Laitinen, and Markku Kommonen. A young Michael Zorkin is next to Timo. He didn't like it much. It was one of the last events he attended in Finland. Later, he would describe the sailing trip in the following way in our discussions. He had no interest in postmodernism or the games that architects began to play. Trends, he said, first transform taste in architectural acceptance, and then they begin to rewrite this transformed architecture. We conform both to an expected present as much as an imagined past. If we speak about history as that which has happened, he said, we must also think of those processes that ensure memory is lost or dislocated. And if history itself is always in movement, redefined by our present time, if history is seen as a series of edited events, is it not the emphasis we put on events that shape that history? Would history then not represent a useful or working bias we apply at various times? Timo didn't say it directly, but this working bias was what interested him. Distortion, excess, pretense, and prejudice. Conditioned by the vicissitudes of fashion, taste, and trends, this was why he began to learn Greek in Tuscany to read some of the original texts. I recall he spoke often of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest, author of a series of sacred texts, which became the basis of Hermeticism. I fancy he told me he thought all architectural texts were hermetic. But I might have dreamed that sentence. But an architect retreating to Tuscany to write a 1,000-page volume on hermetic architectural texts, now I couldn't resist that. Georges Perec, Timo Penttilä wasn't. But that didn't matter. This was dynamite. I would like to go briefly into the politics of architectural friendship. It is as important here as it is in Finland, as it is in Canada, where I come from, and the games that are played. To understand Timo Penttilä, why he came to Vienna, why he later oscillated between Tuscany and Lapland, we need to look at these politics. These are the networks that influence, shape, and create both the architect's interests, the directions of their work, and more significantly, the shapes this friendship can take. For example, During my time in Finland in the 1970s and the time I met Timo Penttilä before he left for Vienna, there was a group of architects and a few intellectuals, philosophers like George Henrik von Wright. He was the Finnish commentator and friend of Wittgenstein. And Dr. Martti Siirola. He was an existential phenomenologist, a psychiatrist, familiar and also a friend of R.D. Lang. This group would meet at the architect K.O. Petäjä's house in Lauttasaari, the Western Island, 15 minutes from Helsinki city centre. There, in a low modernist house, they would discuss architecture, culture, and philosophy. The house was designed by and belonged to K.O. Petäjä, an architect who had worked with Viljo Revel on the Palace Hotel in Helsinki. Petäjä usually invited Penttilä, Penttilä, and Pallasmaa. That made the 4 Ps. It was a curious group. Petäjä and Penttilä, somewhat senior, with some major work behind them, and the younger duo of Timo Penttilä and Juhani Pallasmaa. Penttilä had, of course, completed some of his major Finnish works, including the image on the screen, including the Helsinki City Theatre, 1967, which had rocketed him to Finnish architectural stardom, and somewhat an international name through the power of the Museum of Finnish Architecture. Petäjä was keen to discuss Heidegger and related philosophy, and one or other of the invited would prepare a small paper or then discuss a recent work of their own. The group is little known, but it is perhaps significant for including Timo Penttilä, a man given to listening rather than speaking, to disagreeing with most of what was being said, and someone who clearly did not think the world began and ended with Martin Heidegger. But he did think everyone else misinterpreted Martin Heidegger. These 4 characters were not so much in search of an author or an identity. They shared very different architectural approaches. But it is key to the differences that Penttilä faced when he met the sort of prejudice towards the end of the 70s and started thinking of moving abroad. They all used materials in a different way, from concrete to steel, from brick to tile. They thought structures out differently. Penttilä played in his inimitable manner, trying to introduce humour where often there wasn't any humour. Petäjä was anything but solid, unwavering, systematic, and deadly serious. Timo Penttilä looked on, and Juhani Pallasmaa was slowly being introduced to Heidegger and phenomenology. His Marxist-Leninist soul was thawing, as Marx gave way to Heidegger and Gaston Bachelard. Even today, a study of Pallasmaa's circles from that time will identify the politics of ideology and gossip in Finnish architecture, and how it has changed each decade, how it influenced Timo Penttilä from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. This was the moment before postmodernism would shuffle the pack and throw any lingering Marxist-Leninism to the wolves. It was the moment when critical thinking began to loosen in architecture. Strangely enough, and it's important for some of you to know this, there were 2 very strong shadows around this time that played out the politics of architectural friendship in Finland. They were Alvar Aalto and Aulis Blomstedt. Blomstedt, the brother of the older Pauli Blomstedt, guided the young rationalists with enigmatic mysticism worthy of the Norberg Schultz of the Intentions in Architecture time. Architecture, Blomstedt would write in one of his many aphorisms, is the art of subordination. If you want to create something new, he would say, search for that which is ancient. Aalto was, of course, a completely different kettle of fish. He spoke as early as the 1930s of love in a critical sense. By the way, his writings from the 1930s still bear scrutiny and still stand up to solid reading. But I would suggest around this time, towards the end of the 1970s, Timo Penttilä had an acute and somewhat brilliantly gruff understanding of all that was going on around him. I'm just going to read you 4 passages whilst I go through some of the images of the City Theatre. Some you'll recognize. This is extremely significant building. It was a significant building in many ways. I remember arguing with those who worked with Alvar Aalto in 1977, I think it was, and I said that Aalto's Finlandia Hall could not hold a candle to this building, to the mastery in this building, to the use, the way he structured it on site, the way he nested the building in, the complex program. It's still one of the most exquisite theatre halls to come out of in the evening and see the window wall and the trees and the lake behind it. Aalto's is much more central, doesn't offer you that feeling. Finnish, Timo said, was a filter, a language through which he had to take the enormity and madness of his own ideas. He used the Finnish word hulluus. Any of you know, of course, know what it means, the hulluus, this craziness. He used the Finnish word hulluus to describe the madness. We both knew what it didn't mean, but we both also knew what it did mean. Language, he says, misleads people who wish to be misled. Architects, for example, he added. Darwin had got it wrong, he said. Nietzsche wasn't much help. Schopenhauer, a fraction better. Kierkegaard, even closer, and Spinoza, forget him. Dawkins had compounded all this. It was careless precision, he said. He went on to explain, though he said, it's all in the book. By now, he presented me with what was going to be anywhere between a 700 and 1,000 page volume on architecture. He went on to explain, Darwin didn't say much about natural selection, but what he did say was enough to assume serious error. Architects have survived by picking up on error. Error after error. Errors that have been going on since Vitruvius. Vitruvius had been, in today's jargon, he said, a surfer, courting philosophies and philosophers, known only through unspent concentration. It was possible he had no real understanding of them. How far back did this ignorance and error go? I asked him. How far back would you like to go? He replied. This model shows the complexity of the City Theatre and the way it nestles into the landscape. Timo didn't go into detail about the 1960s and the way he, like many architects of the other expressive persuasion, this was considered an expressive work at the time. They were attacked by what he saw as mindless orphans of a distorted Marxism. He was careful about the words, mindless orphans of a distorted Marxism. He didn't need to. Instead, he said, I go yachting and use what little fame and reputation I gain to enjoy myself. Any resistance, he said, is brief and misguided. Was he right in thinking that architecture had continued in such a misguided way for so long? This I just couldn't get out of my mind. This is the promenade you come out, when you come out of the upper balconies and the tiers and come down and hug the building to the forest and the lake. It's a very beautiful experience at all times of the day, if you're at a matinee in the afternoon or if you're at the evening. There are times in this book when I don't know who said what. It didn't matter. Neither of us had any agenda, no program for what we were sharing. The evening was drawing to a close. Italy were not playing football tonight. We watched all the Euro football together. My own props for nothingness had become nothing. I could not see any way to turn this into architectural writing, even an essay. I would be punished for the frivolity. I had no interest in being objective, in thinking this through. He felt the same. It had all been accidental, whether writing or building, he said. My first buildings were accidents. Fine ones, I said. The City Theatre the best. He'd heard it before. There was no need to continue and explain why. The building was sited so perfectly towards the bay and embedded into the earth, there was no comparison to Aalto's Finlandia Hall. The sequence was more subtle and seductive. It didn't need writing out at all. But how have we supported our own fictions that have become uncritical histories to keep us going? This is a very interesting detail. It could have been a detail from the architect Aulis Blomstedt. It could have been a detail from Timo Penttilä. It would not have been a detail from Roger Connah. But the sort of control, the element of this, and the use of the tile, which he perfected well in parts of the City Theatre, surpass at some moments some of Aalto's treatment of tile. This is again the Suomen Sokkari building that is now being destroyed. I show this, and I'm going to just, all of you know, well, maybe you don't all know about emoticons and using emoticons, but you all know what it means to heart Finnish architecture, or I-3 Finnish architecture, or and you can get the heart on your emoticon menu. And this is called emoticons and Finnish architecture. Whether Timo Penttilä will get a reassessment of his life and work is uncertain. There is an Austrian production which remains, as I said, somewhat foreign to the Finnish society. I hope someone decides to study it, possibly one of you seated out there. But what led to this critical exile? Can we still speak of the cathedral of critical misery? Finnish architecture has long confused any critical understanding of its achievement, which has, let's acknowledge, been extraordinary, and still is. But there is a stifling protectionism about it. Last year, I was invited to write the opening piece for a new information and promotion website, finisharchitecture.fi. I shouldn't have been asked to write it. So I entitled my piece, I Heart Finnish Architecture, and wrote poetry. I heart Finnish architecture because it still wears the fedora, often out of place. I heart Finnish architecture because it still takes out the corduroy jacket, the Mau Mau flak jacket of the card-carrying architects. I love Finnish architecture because it still hangs off balconies by the fingers, testing the braggadocio of artists, actors, filmmakers, and architects. I love Finnish architecture because the Marimekko shirts are still suitably lined and graphically fashioned, though the metal buttons seem a little flimsy today. I love Finnish architecture because it still smokes the wrong and right cigars and offers lectures on them. I love Finnish architecture because it still secretly puts comrades under house arrest for exposing the shadow lines. I love Finnish architecture because it still makes new rules that disguise the old and uses the old rules to get into the club everyone else has just left. I love Finnish architecture and the new club it creates from the old, where the membership has renamed itself the Remainder. This was the sort of promotion, sort of language that Penttilä would not only have found distasteful, but he insisted, as we sat in the evening sun in Tuscany, deflected intellectual adventure from architecture itself. The promotion of architecture had become that cathedral. I didn't need much persuading to agree with him. Propaganda has always inserted itself between the achievement of Finnish architecture, self-censorship, and the clear dearth of critical acumen. I imagined this club of Finnish architects called The Remainder. The Remainder is a novel written by Tom McCarthy, 2005. After apparently suffering from an accident, something falling from the sky, the protagonist is awarded 8.5 million in damages. He then spends his time with obsessive detail and planning, reconstructing and reenacting the senses, scenes, situations, and scenarios from his pre-accident memory. Memory, identity, and history all return to a point that can never return, like those restore points on computers before the upgrade checks and removes previous versions. This is not a reenactment of the past or a rehearsal. This is a reenactment of the abandoned past, retrieved by compulsive detail. Eventually, the reenactment of home, buildings, roads, traffic, houses, life events, and smells, everything is planned. Reconstruction everywhere, Tom McCarthy writes. I looked down at the interlocking, hemmed-in fields and had a version of the whole world's surface cordoned off, demarcated, broken into grids in which self-duplication patterns endlessly repeated. Some of you will be looking at this picture thinking, I won't say what you have to say on emoticon language, WTF or something like that, but someone looking at this thinking, what's that all about? It's really about the untranslatable, sisu. All Finns in this audience know exactly what I'm talking about. All non-Finns haven't a clue what I'm talking about. But it's to do with stamina, everything to do with stamina, dignity, respect, perseverance, challenge. I do love Finnish architecture that so often rushes to reconstruct the remainder from its past. Exiled in Vienna, Tuscany, and Supru, Lapland, did Timo Penttilä not suggest, so long ago as 1985, the impending prejudice project, which was Finnish architecture, simplified and concise, somewhere hanging between the right and wrong architect? Timo Penttilä got involved in a critical inquiry that would never end, which was what fascinated me about him. The book about him, The Exile Invented, is not the contemplation of a monk wondering how to become a hermit, like the Trappist monk Thomas Merton. Penttilä retreated to remain direct, uncomplicated, challenged, and relevant, and to stay alive. He faced the Mau Mau gang in the late 1970s and early 80s in their flak jackets. The challenges today may pretty much be the same, even in what is now our digital webland. Perhaps only the jackets and the coloring books have changed. I'll finish with some, I hope not too distasteful, but relevant lines, which will not be published on the finisharchitecture.fi website. I heart Timo Penttilä because he still brokers the constructed world and its reconstructions. I heart Timo Penttilä because the doors of the Cathedral of Critical Misery are constantly being redesigned with new hinges. I heart Timo Penttilä because he knows the new locks, new materials and details are bullied into weak, critical submission. I love Timo Penttilä because he knew this Cathedral of Critical Misery is boarded up for the tourist season in order to prevent vandalism. I love Timo Penttilä because the latest attempt to build an extension to the new chapel for the lost modernist will struggle against the new chapel for the quintessential modernist. I love Timo Penttilä because the hand drawings are ready after the invited competition, and he knows the selected jurors just have to decide on the right or wrong architect. Can we join the dots and still love Timo Penttilä? Is it suitable even to invent Penttilä as the last modernist? He would surely not be surprised today to see Finnish architecture is now a novel, a fiction, an appropriation. It can be reconstructed over and over again. It is promoted and run from a cockpit where a man is holding a gun to the pilot's head, telling the pilot to keep turning back to the airport and then keep turning round. The pilot is confused. He should return to the airport. Fuel is running short. The situation becomes even more real after the air traffic control insists this is no longer a reenactment. This event cannot be reconstructed, reversed, or reinvented, however much money is made available. We all wish this at times to be free of the coded and defaulted systems, reversals, reclamations, and structures that guide our inventions, whether in architectural production, architectural teaching, or design scholarship. Yet we all usually drag this or that program or agenda into our seeing architecture, into our writing architecture, into our histories and our pedagogical engagement. Passion and commitment fight for self-honesty, whilst we struggle against chosen and narrowed policies and inherent strategies, which require from us space and time beyond guile to survive. Penttilä grappled with this. Meanwhile, a forklift truck rams into the specially designed and strengthened doors of the cathedral. The architect is migrant, vagrant, or nomad? Was this self-exile? In the last years of his life, Timo Penttilä had sold his Italian farmhouse and vineyard and moved back to Lapland. He always said Lapland to me when he spoke of his fishing in Supra, not Finland, and never via Helsinki. In these last few years, according to his friend and partner Kari Lind, he worked with his Lap neighbor turning large, ancient, felled and dried logs into some sort of worked sculpture. He probably would not have called these sculptures. There will be little history of this as the two men winched and struggled to get the huge logs in place to be worked on. The evenings were probably spent around a fire. Who knows the conversation? Who needs to know the conversation? Penttilä knew the unspoken might be spoken more than occasionally, but that not much of anything is revealed from afar beyond that moment. These dead tree trunks were fashioned into withered but possibly wise sculptures, a thinking through the land. Timo Penttilä knew too well what the Finnish poet Paavo Haavikko wrote. There are many wise men, but not one stupid tree. Thank you. As they say, the floor is yours. I will just show this picture of the young Penttilä in front of the Helsinki City Theatre. That was the remaining part of what I showed you at the beginning. When our ideologists complain that modern man neglects architecture to his own detriment, I, on the other hand, claim that idealistic architectural theory does not take into consideration at all the existence of human individuals who use their own brain for thinking and have their own feelings. That is from a book called siis kyllä. Again, only Finns would know what it means to say no, then yes. Siis kyllä. It is key to Finland, and I hope Tina and Erika, anyone here would cherish that, because it's something so special. This actually is a book about the relationship written by Paavo Haavikko in 2006, the relationship between Finland and Russia, previously the Soviet Union. It is an important phrase. Can I ask anybody if there are any questions? As I said, I'm not an expert, but I thoroughly enjoyed meeting a man just for the short time I did. Whether I've made too much of him, I don't know. I don't think so. I do hope that we can have a drink and we can also talk a little bit more informally. But I was talking with Alfred earlier this evening that I do think that it is important to somehow put in place Timo Penttilä's 18-year teaching the period in Vienna. 18 years, it's a long time. It's a long part of his life. Many people ask me, do you know why he came, apart from the invitation from Rainer, who asked him to become part of the Meisterschule. There are so many rumors, there are so many different stories, and as I said in my small talk, that I wish somebody would just step outside and detach themselves and recount what happened in those periods without an agenda and without covering up, without supporting this or that ideology or what it means about Finnish architecture. Those of you in this room probably know, just as maybe you talk about the Viennese bubble when you live in Vienna, there's the Finns who live in Finland, and it's a little bit of a Finnish bubble. Penttilä doesn't exist for them outside when he left. There's no mention of him, there's no mention of his life, nothing, which I find extraordinary. Maybe that's natural in the cultural pathology that you cover up, but I do think he deserves, the situation deserves, the culture deserves, and architecture deserves to have somehow the story opened up a little more. And I do hope some of you are able to do that. Put aside any disagreements, but just bring it out. Alfred, would you like to say anything? Would anybody like to say anything about that? Would you like to offer, there's a microphone there if you would like. I mean, I don't want to force it. I don't want to force it because the drinks are there and we can have a drink soon, and it's nice to have a drink. Meanwhile, I can have my vodka courtesy of the students.
I think recently I was in Helsinki and I talked to a young musician and talked about who I was studying at, and then he said, "Wow, that's incredible, that's the coolest building in Helsinki. Is it that old?" So I was thinking that it is so that the City Theatre is a building that fits very well in our time, and that's also something that maybe makes us feel a little bit, or me feel comfortable about the whole education with Timo, because I think that his whole thinking, his whole questioning of the background of modern life is something that fits very well in our time. So in that sense, I think it's a good period to maybe rediscuss Penttilä and eventually think about bringing out some more about his work, about not only the theatre, but certainly some of his masterly works. And the other thing that struck me when I was on the Alvar Aalto Congress some years ago, the Vice Mayor of Helsinki addressed me with the direct question, would you oppose to the idea to take down the Hanasaari power plant? And so I think that many of his buildings, since they are very tall buildings, occupying valuable land, partly on the seaside, are in danger to be destroyed. And especially the power plant, I think, if we look to London and we see the Tate Gallery and what they did with the old power plant in London, I think it would be more than a shame not to consider a reuse of the affected power plant, just to take it down. But who of you, first students generation, that's why I looked at Bruno, and could tell some things, but it's...
First of all, I want to thank you, because when I started reading the book, you brought back exactly the Timo Penttilä as I met him, as I experienced him in the school and also in private. And I was very far, it was very far gone since the studies were finished, and many years ago. So for me, it was a really great experience that there is an outer world outside of this school where people also knew Timo Penttilä, because we always had the feeling that he's not evaluated as we experienced his knowledge and his mastery in architecture, or also especially in thinking. So this was a great thing for me. There are a lot of stories I could tell about private meetings, some really interesting comments. They were like little precious things you had to think about first for a few days as a student to fully understand. So it always put you back, but in the end, it put you forward very far. And it freed you. This was the main thing, I think. It freed you from your little selfish or your little self or your small thoughts, and it opened up. I mean, the main, or maybe just to finish, the main thing, or one of his main sayings to my work was, he drew a rectangle. My design was very sensitive to reacting to the surroundings, everything, and he drew a rectangle and said, why don't you do it like that?
What language did you use predominantly with him? Were you using English or both?
No, German.
German. I would just like to continue the point what Alfred made, because I think if you saw it in your city, in Vienna, if you thought of, I don't know, a building by Hollein, Haus, for example, or a building by Coop Himmelblau, or another building, and see how those have struggled or represent different ideologies. There are 3 buildings in Finland that really, well, 4 actually, that really suffer the same problem as this city theatre, and it was completely critically misrepresented in favor of the rationalists who could not deal with the type of architecture. And one of the buildings was Dipoli by Penttilä in Otaniemi. The other was Finlandia Hall by Alvar Aalto. And the third one, which was actually execrated in the press, absolutely demolished in the press, was the Tempeli Aukio Church. Some of you may know it's called the Church in the Rock. It was utterly hated. I mean, the vitriol, and I mean, it's down in you've got to remember, and maybe you have that vitriol in a smaller place like Vienna too, but the vitriol that comes through when you look at architectural reviews from that time was pretty extreme. This was not this was not only a cathedral of critical misery, the whole city was critically miserable, because there was no generosity, there was no appreciation of the actual architectural strengths of these buildings. They were all measured against what they were not. And this will be the same. Dipoli has struggled to survive. The church in the rocks will survive because it's the most visited building in Finland, in Helsinki, ever. Finlandia Talo will survive, of course, but it's quite possible that if there's no activism, no strength about something like the Hanasaari power plant, which is an exquisite piece of, it's an exquisite work. I mean, Finland doesn't have, of its type, anything better than that. If that's in danger of destruction, I would suggest we get to the barricades immediately, and start picking up the sur les pavés, la plage. I mean, because it's important. It really is important. And some of you have a depth to Penttilä that is important in this respect. And I think, even a decent production of his work, both in Finland and in Vienna, including some of his whatever lectures, should be attempted. I really do think this should be attempted somehow. That's just to say I'm ready to go to the barricades. Should we have a drink? Or?
Yeah. Roger said to me that when he's teaching in Canada, the Canadians, they usually do not come up with questions after lectures. And I told him, you will feel at home in Austria, it's just the same. So if there's no more question, I would say thank you very much. The books are on the table. Roger will generously sign, and the buffet is open. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.